All right, guys. I'm gonna get it started. My name's Benji. I handle marketing here at Sightline Climate. It feels like we've crossed some kind of threshold with data centers. We put out some research this week, and already we've had conversations with half a dozen mainstream news outlets, in addition to our usual friends in the energy and climate media sphere. Um, and I'd say, a year ago, this was mostly an industry conversation, and now it's broken through. It's everywhere. Bernie called for a moratorium. Trump pledged ratepayer protection in the State of the Union, and late night hosts are cracking jokes about grid reliability. Um, Meanwhile, in town halls across the country, people are arguing about data centers, water consumption, noise, whether the promise of tax revenue is worth the disruption. I watched a bunch of those videos on YouTube last night. It's a tense moment. At the same time, we've got this constant drumbeat of massive infrastructure announcements and the interconnection debate at the national and state level about those rules. At the heart of it, there's the narrative that we're probably all sick of by now. AI is booming, data centers are booming, the grid is the bottleneck. And parts of that story are absolutely true. But when we step back and look at the actual construction pipeline, the picture gets more complicated. So we've got a lot to unpack today. Luckily, unpacking is on brand at Sightline. Our platform is built on an AI engine that drinks from the fire hose of information, connects that data across our technology benchmarks, investment trackers, company and project data, and then we layer on the expertise of our research team to help utilities, energy companies, investors, governments, and banks make decisions using up-to-date interconnected data. This is what we do. So I'm going to get right into it and introduce Olivia Wang, our research analyst who built the Q1 2026 Data Center Outlook, which you should download if you haven't already. I'll put a link in the chat. She'll walk through her findings. And then we've got a change in the lineup for our guests. We lost one guest and picked up three. I know we had promised scale microgrids. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. Instead, we have a full panel of expert operators to pressure test our findings with their real experience in development, balance sheet risk, supply chain, and political backlash. At the end, we'll have time for audience questions. So put your questions in the Q&A tab throughout, and I'll be monitoring that closely. Olivia, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Benji, for setting the scene and for the fun beats to start our day. I'm going to share my screen. Awesome. So, hi, everyone. As Benji said, my name is Olivia Wang, and I cover data centers on the research team here at Sightline Climate, which means collecting data and making sense of data on data centers. At a granular level, we're looking at the project themselves, who's developing them, how they're powered, and what policies and pushback they're facing. And then on a higher level, we are unpacking what that means for utilities, IPPs, investors, hyperscalers across the energy space. This is Sightline's first quarterly data center outlook. We're going to be publishing this every quarter, and each time we'll cover what's changed in the sector in terms of deployment, projects, investments, and what that means for energy and policy. Let's get into it. Since we have three wonderful guests joining us today, whose on-the-ground insights will be much more helpful, I'll be covering the highlights of the report. I'll start with deployment trends, a look at where these projects are coming online and when. I'll then jump into the headline of the quarter, and then highlight a few notable projects, companies, policies, and deals. Leave you with a few key takeaways at the end too. Again, if you like the full version or access to the database, Benji is your guy. All right, up first, deployment trends. Where are these projects and when are they coming online? So for context, Sightline is tracking more than 750 large data centers announced since the beginning of 2024. They make up at least 190 gigawatts. And here's a look at the capacity pipeline by year. Couple of highlights from this chart. For one, data center deployment hit a new high last year. Almost 6 gigawatts of data center capacity came online last year. And in the teal bar here, at least 5 gigawatts are already under construction this year. So while the power and shortages are absolutely real, developers who have locked in contracts and are putting steel into the ground and bringing chips online, there is no doubt about that. That being said, project delivery dates are unreliable. At the beginning of this year, we reviewed 110 projects that were originally slated to come online by the end of last year. And what we found was that a quarter of these projects were delayed. That's this sliver in red here, and now are likely spilling into an already ambitious 2026. We also found that 10% of the projects from last year quietly shifted their commissioning dates back to this year and the next few years. I think what's notable here is that these projects slated to come online last year were planned 2 to 3 years ago, predating a lot of today's acceleration in AI demand and labor shortages and supply shortages. So these projects that were developed under relatively, comparatively easier conditions struggled to come online last year. Newer projects this year are likely facing even steeper challenges. Now, taking a look at this year, we're expecting at least 16 gigawatts coming online by year end, which would be almost 3x what came online last year. And this 16 gigawatts is just a floor. Roughly 20% of projects slated for delivery in December of this year have not disclosed their capacity. So this definitely adds to that 16 gigawatt for 2026. Notably, only 5 gigawatts in that teal bar is under construction, leaving in yellow here 11 gigawatts of the 16 gigawatts in the announced stage with no signs of construction. With a due date of December 31st, that leaves less than a year for the majority of planned capacity to progress from early stage development to energized operational facilities. Typical data center construction timelines run from 12 to 18 months, even after permitting and power access are secured. And of course, some of these announced projects might be further along than disclosed, but we would expect significantly more capacity to be under construction formally if it were truly slated to come online this year. For all these reasons, the 25% delays from last year, the quiet COD shifts, the lack of construction progress, we're expecting 30 to 50% of projects to be delayed this year. A key part of the delays that is not quite captured in this chart, but is really important, is the increase in local opposition, which will be a key part of this year's story. Beyond technical and logistical hurdles of securing all the parts of a project, community resistance is now a material driver of attrition in the development pipeline. I'm tracking over 10 new moratoriums proposed across the country since the beginning of January in really key data center states, Virginia, Louisiana, Michigan, New York, and Ohio. So what here is pretty significant. Announced capacity is not delivered capacity, and underwriting to projected timelines carries real risk right now. Now, a look at the capacity by region. The US dominates the global pipeline, 103 gigawatts across 332 projects, which is 8 times more than the next largest region, the UK. Definitely, this is reflective of domestic hyperscaler concentration, access to immense investor capital, access to land, and regulatory frameworks that allow multi-hundred megawatt projects to move forward in parallel. But the sliver in red here shows that the US leads in delays too. And here we think what the US struggles with today, other markets will absolutely be facing later. As these gigawatt scale projects become more common in Asia and Europe, these regions will confront these same trade-offs that the US is now navigating. How quickly new generation and transmission can be built, how load is prioritized, and who bears the costs of these system upgrades. When we zoom into the US a bit more, there's some notable trends here too. Texas, as expected, is in a league of its own with 22.5 gigawatts of planned capacity. The state is absolutely leading the build out across the world. And that's due to the promise of fast interconnection, abundant generation, and a developer-friendly market structure that's drawn massive investments. But it's also already starting to show strain. We tracked 6 projects there last year that were delayed. And while Texas seems attractive from a project development perspective, ERCOT's infamous price volatility and physical risk from extreme weather markets makes actually operating data centers quite challenging. In terms of opportunity, we're looking at the gray area on this map, especially in this SPP corridor. The transmission operators serving the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and parts of Texas, New Mexico, and Arkansas had its board approve the high impact large load policy recently in September, which was subsequently approved by FERC earlier this year. This policy is fast tracking large load connections to the grid by pairing them with new or existing generation through a 90-day study and approval process. This is the first framework of its kind in the nation. So we're watching here for more development announcements in these states, despite having seen comparatively fewer projects so far. The question we get asked most is how these data center projects are getting power. So we broke down all these projects by powering type and found that by project count, grid-connected sites make up the largest share, about 45%, but nearly as many projects, 43%, have not yet announced their powering source. That might be because developers don't want to announce their powering strategy, but it also could just because they simply might not have a plan yet. And what we're also seeing here is that despite the hype for on-site and hybrid approaches, they remain pretty niche in absolute numbers, together accounting for less than 10% of projects here. But when measured by capacity, on-site and hybrid projects really punch above their weight here. Grid-connected projects still lead at 40%, but on-site generation and hybrid projects account for a third of announced capacity, far exceeding their share by project count. The second most asked question for us is what the hyperscalers are doing in terms of powering strategy. And it's a very fair question. They are the ones driving the build out, committing hundreds of billions of dollars into their own projects and signing as tenants for others. They're shaping policy. So we tallied up here how much capacity we're tracking per hyperscaler and the powering plans for each. Now, just to note that not all the projects that they've disclose capacity or powering plans. Actually, many of their projects don't. So this chart captures only their projects that have disclosed those two variables. We found that grid-connected projects remain the most popular powering model for hyperscalers, especially for capacity with near-term commissioning dates. But as you can see here, hyperscalers are increasingly willing to accept the additional complexity of building and managing on-site power in exchange for certainty on capacity, timelines, and emissions. Oracle really stands out here with predominantly on-site and hybrid capacity, and this is really driven by their involvement in Stargate. They're working on a gigawatt in Abilene, gigawatt in Shackelford, Andonia Anna, and Port Washington. And they absolutely have the most aggressive strategy here, but also the earliest stage projects. Google's pipeline looks also grid heavy for now, but with its recent Intersect acquisition, it now has access to 10.8 gigawatts of solar storage and gas. And when these sites are confirmed to be co-located with data centers, Google will have the largest share of on-site powered projects. As we see these project announcements roll in every day, nonstop, a big part of our job, as I'm sure it is many for you, as is the case for many of you in the audience, is to assess project risk. So here are some of the key factors we consider. What's the project status? What's the permitting status? Is there a powering plan? Have there been tenants announced and signed? Has the company or project raised the necessary capital? Who is the owner developer? And what's their track record? We use this initial methodology to assess each project and are using it to develop a de-risked forecast based on these metrics. I'll be excited to hear if it measures up to the criteria that our panelists use for assessing the projects that they see come across their desks. In terms of investments, because that's also something Sightline tracks closely, we're seeing data centers dominating the built environment sector, accounting for 78% of 2025 capital, with funding concentrated really in a small number of outsized rounds. Within that total, a large majority of funding is going to developers, but companies working on optimization and backup power are also drawing eight-figure deals. And 2026 is not showing signs of slowing down. Q1 is already shaping up to be a record quarter, thanks to day one's $2 billion Series C in January. The Singapore-based startup raised indicates that the market outside the US are starting to accelerate in their data center deployment as well. In our full outlook, you can see in detail the notable late-stage deals into developers, as well as earlier stage deals into speed to power tech, like aeroderivatives, solid-state transformers, flexibility, and optimization. We're also highlighting a few leading backup generation providers, those helping projects with behind-the-meter and bridge-to-grid solutions. This is just a preview of a backup power leaderboard we will be publishing in Q2, so stay tuned and please reach out if you'd like to give your perspective or be included in the leaderboard. Finally, there are three standout pieces of policies we highlight as notable from this past quarter. First is FERC's ANOPR, the proposed federal framework that would assert jurisdiction over transmission-level large loads, standardize interconnection procedures, and most importantly, assign 100% of network upgrade costs to the load project. That's a significant shift in project economics, and it's designed to, in part, filter out speculative announcements and speed up interconnection. The final rulemaking should be issued in April. Second is Ireland's recent lifting of its 5-year moratorium on data centers. Ireland's regulator has reopened its door to data centers, but only if those data centers show up with sourcing 80% of its power from newly commissioned renewables, install on-site generation or storage capable of meeting 100% of peak demand, and provide active grid support and disclose annual energy and emissions data. Here, grid access has really become a clean energy lever, not just a queue position. It rewards bundled solutions and creates real transparency, and we think it's a model that will be copied. Finally, FERC's co-location ruling for PJM in December, which PJM actually responded to earlier this week. They proposed 3 new transmission service options, which reforms behind-the-meter generation rules, firm contract demand, non-firm contract demand, and interim non-firm. The key impact will be faster, more flexible grid access for data centers while stimulating storage and on-site generation. It's the lightest touch approach to data center integration with no new capacity required, and we think if it passes and is successful, will be adopted widely across other states as well. The common thread here is that all 3 of these policies, grid operators have real leverage right now, and they're using it to pull grid supporting assets into data center deals. So the key takeaways from the outlook are as follows. What you need to know: the quiet delays are rising. Second, there's a real gap between what's supposed to come online this year and what's real right now. As a result, we expect 30 to 50% of 2026 projects to be delayed. We're watching hyperscalers write and operate from a new powering playbook, which is developing power projects themselves. That's Google's acquisition of Intersect and Amazon's solar and storage acquisition in Oregon. And fifth, BESS is becoming critical for both speed to interconnection and flexibility. Developers like Aligned and CyrusOne have deployed BESS to bring their projects online years sooner than what would have been possible. In terms of what we're watching, grid operators are using regulation as leverage to woo data centers into their region, but are trying to do so without blowing up everyone else's rates. The SPP and PJM, for example, promising faster connection for its data centers to come online if it comes with generation or flex their demand. and 50 large load tariffs across the country are incorporating grid upgrade charges. So we'll see if hyperscalers prioritize regions with expedited connections and clarity despite the cost requirements or sidestep the grid entirely. We'll also be watching to see how other hyperscalers respond to Google and Amazon's aggressive asset acquisitions. And we'll be watching movement in smaller, flexible thermal units like recip engines, aeroderivatives, as well as fuel cells. We think they'll be seeing an increase in deployments in the next 2 years. As for what this all means for utilities and grid operators, we think it's about speed and clarity. Utilities that can give quick decisions on interconnection and service agreements have the advantage, even if they can't provide the gigawatts right away. The clearly defined rules around curtailment or bring your own generation helps developers assess risk and either build or move on. For hyperscalers, we think it could be time to trade the bragawatts for speed. Bigger might not always mean better. Smaller can mean faster. We're seeing Microsoft go for this with their connected campus playbook with Fairwater, and China also with its clustered data center approach. For power providers, renewables alone don't cut it anymore. Hyperscalers and grid operators alike want certainty in firm assets, but any capacity is useful capacity. So lower hanging equipment upgrades and securing multiple units of smaller equipment to unlock near-term capacity remains valuable. That's about it for the highlights. Benji, how are we doing?
Thanks, Olivia. Wonderful presentation. Now it's time to check your homework. To do that, we have three panelists, all operators, also thought leaders. We have someone from an OEM, a powered land expert, a trade group representative. The goal of the panel is to test our findings, particularly the 30 to 50% of delays we're expecting. Talk about a little bit about community opposition, projects falling out altogether from the pipeline, and do that with people on the ground. We also want to find out what resonated from the research takeaways and learn about the key challenges that they're working on. So I'll let you introduce them one by one, and I'll come back in for the questions at the end.
Awesome. Thank you, Benji. Great. So for today's panel, we have three amazing guests. First one being Vlad Ujigov. Vlad is the president and founder of the Western Canada Data Center Alliance, which is a member-based group and advisory for the digital infrastructure industry. In addition to his role with WCDCA, Vlad is a national data center power systems lead at Schneider Electric and has provided guidance and strategy recommendations to stakeholders across the industry, especially relating to site selection, power strategy, and community engagement. Vlad, welcome, and thank you for dialing in from Canada. Next up, we have Ben Aline. Ben is the CEO and founder of Monarch Energy, which is a company focused on identifying, entitling, and preparing large-scale powered land sites for data centers and advanced manufacturing. Ben began his career in engineering before moving into the power marketing and project development side. Welcome, Ben.
Good morning.
And finally, Thomas Schultz. Thomas leads business development and strategy at DG Matrix, where he helps deploy clean, secure, and reliable power technologies for AI data centers, microgrids, and EV charging. DG Matrix is commercializing the world's first multi-port solid-state transformer to solve these power and supply constraints and accelerating time to power from years to months. DG Matrix actually just closed a $60 million Series A last week. So congratulations, Thomas, and welcome. Awesome. All right, let's jump in. I'm going to stop sharing screen here. So we just walked through the data, and I'm excited to have you three industry operators and veterans share your view. I want to start with a quick gut check from each of you on the outlook, and then we'll dig in. We're projecting 30 to 50% of delays, hyperscalers going off-grid for their AI training capacity, and an increase in very effective community engagement. Does that check with what you guys are seeing on the ground? And is there anything you'd want to add, at least for this quarter? Ben, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Olivia. Yes, it's pretty much spot on. We as a powered land developer are out in these local communities requesting permit approvals, conditional use permits, rezones, special use permits, tax abatements. And it's getting really challenging out there. I think a few years ago, most folks around the country didn't know what a data center is. And I think many folks still do not, but they have an idea of them now. And unfortunately, I think the idea has shifted to something negative based on what's being portrayed in the media. And so we're finding it much more challenging on the execution side. I think 2025 was well documented, and the narrative grew that this is a power constrained market. I think that's well accepted now, and the constraint that we're seeing being added on top of that really is the permitting and local approvals, and that's going to take a lot of hands-on and thoughtful development from folks in these local communities. So I think that's what we're seeing as the biggest challenge here this year, on top of course, the power constraints.
Thomas, what about you?
Yes, fully aligned here. First of all, congrats on digging through so much data and figuring out what's actually uh, when was something announced and how much are the delays. So that's not an easy job. Seeing the same things on the field. I think two reasons we're exploring here or we're seeing here. NVIDIA and Google, for example, have often amazing chips, but sometimes the publication, so the release of those chips is a bit delayed. And specifically, when we're talking about the transition from AC powered data centers to DC powered data centers or racks, we can certainly see that there is some uncertainty still, which ultimately leads to delays. So that's chip availability. And the second reason is indeed the availability of equipment, specifically, for example, transformers. Here we're experiencing increasing wait times, and I think many of the data center developers or hyperscalers that announced the data center projects did not realize how much these queues are backlogged, ultimately leading to significant delays in transformer sourcing, where you have lead times of 6 months, which when you're lucky, up to multiple years when you're a bit less fortunate.
Yeah. Vlad, what about you?
Thanks. Yeah, I think just to echo what everybody's saying, I think what I've heard is, yeah, 2025 was the year of kind of finding and securing places with power, and 2026 kind of the year to me of staying within timelines. So it aligns with what you're finding as well. I thought it was interesting to see that in 2025 there was only a slip of about 10%. I think that's super impressive. I think it's a testament to the fact that the industry is getting faster, better, and more efficient. At the same time, they're combating things like frontier markets, right? A lot of the new growth is in frontier markets, markets that are unproven, where maybe the permitting process isn't as established or known as in other places. So I think there's forces kind of competing against each other here. But yeah, I think diversification of power sources, as you pointed there, like the microgrid type of solution, is going to help speed things up as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Good to validate on the ground. Appreciate the gut checks there. I have a few pointed questions for each of you, and I'd love to start with you, Vlad. You're convening developers, utilities, municipalities, communities all in one room with your work in Canada. What are the points of real consensus right now, and where does the room get contentious? And specifically, I want to know, are these tensions mirroring what's happening in the US directly, or are there Canada-specific fault lines we should know about?
Yeah, I think they're largely the same here. I think we're a relatively new market for these large projects. So in Canada, we're hearing some of the same points brought up. I think one of the things that resonates once the information's shared, and there's some education campaigns kind of completed on it, is like data centers are essential infrastructure. Once communities learn that they have a stake in the construction of these, that there's jobs tied to them, that these are essential pieces of the economy, of society, I think that really resonates with folks. I think the industry is getting a lot better at sharing this information as well. Historically, maybe digital infrastructure wasn't as in the open as it has been, and it hasn't had a reason to really share what goes on in these facilities, what the community impact is, what kind of jobs there are. I think having that stake in the project and understanding what it could mean in terms of impact, I think that's the biggest driver. I think the fact that I've spoken at some of these kind of community events, and some of the questions were like, would you want to live by a data center? And the answer can be that, if you go to an urban center anywhere in the world, there's numerous smaller data centers operating. There can be people living in the same building as some of these data centers. So I think just sharing that type of information is helpful.
Awesome. I want to dive into that community engagement aspect a little bit more. In the Outlook, we use a Meta project in Michigan as a case study for what organized opposition can do. And the work that you do brings in those communities directly, as you've said. I'm curious from the developer side, what does good community engagement look like? And what do you think developers are still getting wrong right now?
So I think this report helps. I think this kind of data and studies help. I think kind of demystifying the data center project lifecycle, the development lifecycle, and how it works, how there's a funnel of proposed projects and confirmed projects, and how that works. I think that does a lot of good to really demystify it. And one of the examples that I use sometimes is if you look at projects that have been seeing opposition, a lot of them, because they're so early on in the development cycle, they're not able to provide definitive figures for how much water is used, the type of noise attenuation that's in place, not the job figures and all that, because a lot of this is speculative in the beginning, right? Because developers come in, they're trying to land the hyperscaler to come in. I think this is going to lead to a fundamental shift in this development life cycle. I think there may be a concentration of sites, concentration of developers potentially, because now the end users, the hyperscalers, need to be involved in these projects earlier on. I think communities rightfully are asking, who's going to be the tenant? What are their requirements? What are their designs like? And developers that aren't in touch with end users may not be able to answer those questions. And if you tell a community that, this can use 1,000 liters or, 1,000 gallons per day to 1 million gallons per day, and that's the range, I think communities will just assume that it's the latter, it's the higher end, right? So ranges might not cut it anymore. I think coming in with these specific figures is really going to help, and I think these reports really show that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Ben, I'd love to move to you. Monarch's whole thesis is getting ahead of the hard stuff. You're securing and entitling powered land before a hyperscaler even shows up. And your team is made up of former power traders, grid specialists handling interconnection, permitting, and land prep end to end. Please walk us through your order of operations when you're evaluating a site. What do you look at first? And what's the thing that might kill a deal before people even realize it?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of variables, as you just mentioned, Olivia, and you can get distracted by things that don't matter, in fact. And so we try to focus on the things that we see mattering the most to our customers. And of course, that starts with power. That is really our DNA, and finding robust spots on the transmission grid where we think there could be some available utility power. That's getting harder and harder to find these days. We really focus on the highest voltage systems. So typically that's going to be your 345 kV system or 230 kV system, depending on which RTO you're in. And really looking deeply into those areas with the various tools that we use to understand what kind of available headroom might be in the near term, but then working closely with the utilities. There's no transmission line in America that has 1,000 megawatts just available on it. And so when we're looking at hyperscale sites, we look for how much can we get in the near term, but showing that line of sight in the longer term to a very large project. And so that's a really important piece for us that kind of defines where we go. Another thing that I don't know gets enough attention, I think it's pretty fundamental to the business is of course, economic incentives. So there's a group of states in the US, I believe it's around 38 states, that have a state sales and use tax exemption or some similar name like that. And it's really, really important to our customers. These companies are investing tens of billions of dollars into these projects. And so that, of course, is the initial CapEx build out. But I think one thing that gets lost on folks is that every few years, these chips need to be replaced and they're being upgraded with the latest technology. And so that is a recurring, very large, multi-billion-dollar bill that has a sales tax piece associated with it. And so you're finding that you've got pretty much a binary go, no go position on certain states in the US, depending on whether or not that sales tax exemption exists. So, that defines things as well. And then, of course, looking really closely at site characteristics, cannot be in a FEMA flood designation. That's very much a hard no-go for all of our customers. But then other things like wetlands, endangered species, amassing 1,000 acres, with access to these high voltage transmission lines, is pretty difficult in these areas, particularly when you've got other developers from solar and storage and wind that have picked up a lot of the good sites over the years in some of these areas that do have access to robust transmission. So, that industry has been around a bit longer and has had their kind of run of the mill on sites. And so, those are the major things we look for. And then, lastly, of course, community engagement and understanding early how the community is going to respond and making sure we're communicating with leadership and making sure they understand what it is that we're going to be bringing to the community and also what our asks are going to be of that community and what we need from support and making sure that we are all aligned in what we're intending to perform there.
Mm-hmm. And with that framework, are there states that you are most excited about right now? You mentioned the sales tax, and there's also, large load tariffs going on and tax breaks elsewhere. Are these materially impacting the decisions that you're making with working with these hyperscalers?
Absolutely, and it's very dynamic. For instance, historically, you've had states like Virginia, Ohio, Texas, Arizona that have been leading the charge here for the industry. But just recently, you've seen some potential legislation being passed in Virginia, Texas, Ohio, and Arizona that would materially change the outlook for development for data centers. And some of those legislative changes are being proposed more on the tax incentive side, or on the Texas side of things. For instance, we've got major market overall going through the legislation right now with SB6 and other rule changes for how we study large loads. And so it's truly day by day where we are following these changes and trying to understand how they're going to impact the outlook. And the name of the game, really, our takeaway is this business is getting harder every day. And selecting the right sites and the right markets and having the right partners is getting more and more challenging. The days of having a site near a substation or near a transmission line and making your requests and getting power and getting permits, that's over. It's a lot more thoughtful. The sophistication has really raised over the last few years.
Yeah. I'd love to follow up with that on the co-location hybrid project side. We saw in the outlook that most of the projects will be grid connected, but an increasing amount are going off grid and hybrid. Is that also what you're seeing with the hyperscalers you're working with? Is that their ask, or is it mostly still grid connected?
Yeah, good question. A big topic of conversation. I think the key point you mentioned, Olivia, is the hybrid. And I think no one's specifically asking for off-grid solutions. I think if customers had their choice, they would prefer grid. But the harsh reality is that grid availability is dropping by the day. And as we look further out on timelines, it's becoming less available. And so the shift is, okay, we need power. And ultimately, our customers, if you can deliver the reliability they need, they're pretty indifferent on where it comes from. That said, I'm not seeing customers being very interested or open to a true islanded project that is fully off-grid. The market has not had to shift there. One of the things that we like to do is to propose a project that has an accelerated energization date based on on-site generation. And so we can energize the first building or two buildings based on on-site gas, but then bring the grid once those upgrades are available and complete from the utility. But that needs to be within a fairly near-term window, a couple of years. It's not a 10-year window. Those sites are getting passed on if you've got to wait a long time for the grid to show up.
Yep, that makes sense. And I think tees up my questions for Thomas next. Well, Thomas, DG Matrix makes solid state transformers that can handle multiple energy sources simultaneously and cut electricity costs and and electricity costs dramatically for projects. Just for people who might not know exactly what a solid state transformer is, can you lay it out for us and what it does that conventional infrastructure doesn't?
Of course, yeah. Solid state transformers specifically are also called digital transformers, as opposed to analog transformers, which have been doing an amazing job powering our world for the past 100 plus years. Analog transformers you can imagine as the iron cores with the copper windings, and they do one thing really well. For example, they step up one voltage to another voltage at very high efficiencies, fully optimized. But now with the new realities of, for example, having multiple sources needing to be blended and then routed to multiple loads. And at the same time, for example, these sources being intermittent, such as solar, with voltage drops when the cloud passes and the voltage going up once the cloud is gone, is very difficult to actually integrate for the grid. And you need a lot of different machines. And what solid state transformers do, and specifically also the DG matrix multi-port solid state transformers, is you can combine and blend and isolate, so protect multiple of these sources. Let's say you have the grid as an AC source and you have solar as a DC source. And for example, you add a gas generator if you have to as another AC source. You have three sources which you can mix and match whichever way you want to, and then route that, for example, to the data center IT racks or to the aux power loads, and make sure that the lights are always on. And if something, for example, if a source all of a sudden drops, immediately you have another source coming online, so the lights will never go off. And in addition, multi-port solid-state transformers actually also simplify the architecture significantly. So, as opposed to the many different devices which you need to do all of these separate jobs, which I just outlined, you have a single thing that does a lot of different things at the same time. And that's one of the great advantages here, where you can really simplify the power distribution architecture in data centers. And that then leads to you being able to densify your GPUs on site and have even larger clusters of GPUs at a very small footprint, that are getting a lot of power and all the power they need.
Mm. Um, I think this ties to Ben's point really well in terms of, maybe projects don't want to be grid connected, or they want to be grid connected, don't want to go off grid, but these off grid projects are happening anyway. And you recently announced a partnership with Exawatt for their completely off-grid gigawatt scale plans. I want to double click into what the real operational challenges are of managing behind the meter power at that scale. What do you think developers and IPPs should know about that type of project and managing the on-site assets?
Yeah. Indeed, Exawatt at PTC announced a $70 billion project, Project Mercury, which is quite exciting. And it's a project where you have a variety of gigawatts of generation that powers multiple gigawatts of IT loads. And here, indeed, you need a massive footprint. So the location will probably be somewhere with great land availability and also sun availability. And you'll have thousands of containers coming from Exawatt, which then route or generate electricity, also store electricity because they have an integrated heat battery. And the electricity then gets routed through our interport machines, our multi-port solid-state transformers, into the IT racks of the data centers. And indeed, it's a feat because you have lots of different containers and generation sources and storage sources which you need to control. And that's certainly also one of there. And then on a system level, also our core IP to control that many sources and activate them in the right moment to then route them to the IT racks.
Mm. So in terms of bottlenecks for faster adoptions of this SST, what do you think is the key bottleneck for a DG matrix? Is it cost, familiarity? Is it the supply chain? What's the friction for you guys?
Yeah, it's certainly familiarity. And the reason is solid state transformers has been researched really well at universities for probably 2 decades. And people have been very excited about this becoming finally a reality. And here we are, and we are commercially deployed. And it's so exciting to see when people do site visits at our deployments and ultimately see the solid state transformers in action, and they can't believe that it's a reality, especially the engineers who've been waiting for it for decades. And that's an amazing moment. So familiarity is important, and then on kind of also on the going down, for example, towards the permitting officers, there's certainly some education also that's needed, and to the designers of data centers or power delivery infrastructure, where we certainly need to do a bunch of education to explain that we can really replace so many devices and that we can really, for example, control our machines in milliseconds, and that we can really make sure that all of the power gets routed the right way and nothing gets exported to the grid if you don't have a license to export, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Congratulations on the raise again and beginning to commercialize this.
Thank
Uh,
you.
awesome. So I've got a few group questions before we open it up to the audience. So audience, if you have questions, please drop it in the chat. We're building, obviously, for a world where it seems like AI demand is essentially infinite. And I've got to ask, what if it isn't? Models are getting more efficient. There's a lot of conversations about inference moving to the edge and potentially even on device. Um, and there's a real case for training demand tapering as foundation models mature. So if that world plays out, a significant chunk of this pipeline and capacity could be stranded. How do you guys think about this as you're, working on your own field, and how do you take into the risk into account, and how does it change what you're building? Big question, I know, but
Sure.
that's something.
Yeah, to me, it's about scale and framing. So in Alberta, Canada, the grid operator has confirmed 1,200 megawatts available for data centers within the next few years. That's just from existing generation without any new generation going online. 1,200 megawatts, when you think about it, it seems quite small these days, which is crazy. It's based on what I saw, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Northern Virginia, the capital of the world in this space, didn't have more than 1,200 megawatts, as recent as 2018, 2019. So just 8 years ago, the leading jurisdiction in the world had as much as a frontier market is proposing purely on the grid for the next couple of years. I think that framing really, really helps. I think we're going to see massive growth. I think even if it's a fraction of what's announced. Um, and the way I look at it, I kind of separate the streams of demand, especially when I talk to a number of folks that are trying to sort of learn as much as possible about this space. So I think there's this like local inherent demand in the market where it's tied to GDP and population growth. And that demand has to get serviced by colocation, by enterprise. Cloud services are in there. Sometimes they're in colo, sometimes they build their own. That demand is a little bit more linear. It is affected by inference and AI and edge and all these developments that increase demand, but it's a little bit more linear where it's tied to each person is tied to each business in that area. And then there's a separate pot of demand where it's not really tied to that. It's more of the AI training side. It's kind of global demand or maybe continental demand. So I think if you start separating the segments of demand, the segments of industry, it becomes a little bit more transparent as to kind of what could happen and what's likely to happen.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll chime in here too. I think that definitely resonates, Vlad. I think from our side of things, I'll go back to just how difficult this business is to execute these projects, and I don't see the demand being the limiting factor here anytime soon. Knowing that every developer and capital allocator out here is trying to find the best sites and still struggling to execute at the levels that we need. For instance, the delays, 30 to 50% of the projects being delayed this year, that's going to push out the available compute. So we think that these challenges of power constraints and permitting difficulties are going to be the limiting factor, and it won't be demand, at least in the next few years, until the end of this decade. I think all bets are off beyond 2030 when we potentially have some new technologies, adding more electricity to the grid and potentially some changes in the demand curve. But as far as what we can control in our pipeline now for these next few years, we see kind of no end in sight on the demand side.
Gotcha.
Yeah, some thoughts that resonated with me, fully aligned that there's so much demand, and in the latest JLL report on data centers, for example, they mentioned that 99% of the data center capacity available currently is leased out. So I don't see the demand slowing down here. And then I think another interesting point here is regarding the change from AI training, which is pretty large right now, to AI inference, which is very soon going to overtake significantly the AI training. For example, when you have autonomous vehicles driving around everywhere, that's also, for example, called inference then. So the need will be there. And the question is also for latency, do you need to shift, or how close do you need to actually shift these data centers for inference to population centers? Or can you also keep them in a rather centralized way? So I think that's going to be a very interesting issue, especially when it comes to powering up those data centers. If you can place them into areas where land is available for also providing sufficient power and grid available, which is typically not where the population centers are, then that would be perfect for inference too. But we'll see what the realities are when we get there.
Awesome. Thank you for the responses. I just have one more question before we open it up. And it's about the tariffs that are hitting electrical equipment very heavily. That's transformers, that's switchgear, that's steel. And you're all either buying this stuff or specifying or advising on projects that use it. I'm curious on your takes of how real it is for you and where specifically it's concentrated, and if it's in how it's impacting your project timelines.
Yeah, for us, I'd say we're very focused on the delivery schedule and the availability of the equipment. That is more important to us and our customers than the price. Of course, higher prices hurt, but there's enough there on the economics that you can probably cover some of these increases. It's really an issue of are we having to push out energization dates, because that's what hurts our industry, and these delays is really coming from the lack of availability on high voltage transformers, breakers, and generation equipment is really what we're most focused on.
Yeah, happy to continue. So we are certainly hedging here against what might happen, but we have onshore and offshore manufacturing capabilities. Certainly building out our onshore capabilities too, and then optimizing, for example, for some of the part assembly in free trade zones to be less affected by global tariffs. But yeah, fully aligned with what Ben is actually saying, that people care more about the availability of the equipment than the cost, because that's, I think, another factoid which is interesting. For every $1 million of, sorry, for every megawatts of IT equipment which you deploy, that generates around $10 to $12 million per year of revenue. And you can quickly recoup with that money whichever increase of tariff you might have.
Yeah, I've seen that number too. It makes the math pencil. Awesome.
I think we'll see more local manufacturing opportunities as well. I think we saw early on Crusoe announce that they're building local manufacturing just to align with their timelines. I think that makes communities happier. I think local industry clusters inevitably lead to more kind of job creation and local manufacturing as well. Yes, there are some things that you just can't manufacture, or you can't find an advantage to do it in a certain spot. But a lot of the other items that go into a data center, it can be assembled or manufactured locally. I think Ireland, you mentioned as a moratorium. That's an interesting case study. I've talked to some of the folks there, and they've told me that yes, the moratorium is here, but as this industry was growing, they had some massive industry creation, architecture, construction, and engineering, and those firms are still thriving because they've started exporting to Europe and broader. So now they're exporting services which didn't exist prior to this data center boom that they had, and they're actually bringing some of that revenue back to Ireland as well.
Yep. Thank you, guys. Benji, any audience questions that we have time for?
We have like 30, so we can't get to all of them. But one thing that came up a couple times is a topic I know is dear to your heart, Olivia. Maybe you can answer this one. It's about flexibility. Are hyperscalers, who are typically high load factor, willing to be flexible, meaning self-supply with their own dispatchable on-site generation during curtailments, in exchange for speed?
Are they? Or yes, they are.
Are they?
I'd say we are looking at three different types of flexibility. One, which is workload flexibility, so shifting it across space or delaying it across time when the grid is stressed, or turning to backup generation to curtail from the grid, and then finding capacity offsite from VPPs, available capacity from the grid. And we think that the most ideal option for developers is not messing with the workload itself. And depending on where they are, it might be hard to actually source capacity, depending on the market that the project is in. So the preferred method of flexibility is actually just diverting to backup generation. So both from if you're going off grid, you need backup generation, but also from a flexibility perspective, we're seeing a lot of those companies deploy more of their capacity on these projects.
I guess a good follow-up to that, and we can open this up to the panel, but how much do data centers value time to power, speed to power, regardless of sort of the cause?
Time to power is incredibly important. That's what really everyone cares about. And to the reliability point, or to the so-called 5 nines in terms of availability of the data centers, we've heard some of our customers saying that they would compromise on one or two of those nines, specifically when it comes to model training, in exchange for being powered up faster.
I'm going to just do speed round and throw in some fun ones. We got questions on data centers in space and data centers underwater. Are you guys looking at this seriously, or probably just speculative at this point?
We're not looking at it seriously. I'll say this as a guy who's focused on doing data centers on land. If we got to put them in space and underwater, that means that the folks who can do it on land are probably holding some pretty valuable positions. So yeah, we'll see where the market goes, but I think there's enough sites on dry land for the time being.
Yeah, and I'll add to that quickly that demand is largely market and location specific. I think that condition is something that I always remind myself of, that yes, we see broader trends, but the speed to power comes with an asterisk, and it's speed to power in the right place where you want to be. So that might answer some of those questions. I think just going back a little bit to the question about are hyperscalers willing to be flexible, I think Ben summed it up very well with the hybrid piece as well. And I think this applies to this question as well. I think hyperscalers will do it when they have to. I don't think any of them are seeking to do it just on their own until they're told that they have to, or they're forced to.
I'm going to try and do one of these answer live for our last one. Let's see if does this show up? Oh no, never mind. I'll read it out. As hyperscalers and colos consider on-site and hybrid power solutions, is it mostly gas generation enabled power, or are folks considering renewables as well? Like referencing the Google Intersect deal.
It's both. I think gas obviously is, and maybe for many environmentalists, including myself, a very unfortunate source for behind the meter power, and a very noisy one often too. Although, for example, if you use fuel cells, you still use mostly natural gas, but ultimately the noise level and the emissions are lower. So that's at least one benefit there. But then, yes, if you have land available, then renewable sources are certainly something that gets added as much as possible and then buffered by energy storage.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that a lot of the renewables developers are trying to make this pivot. There's a big gap though, and you're not able to do a fully renewable supplied project kind of behind the meter, whereas you can do that on gas. And so we see it as kind of step one is gas based generation, and then if you can clean it up, adding that renewables for certain customers that are willing to pay that premium.
Yeah, you hear a lot about firm power. I think combining various sources is the way to go. I think battery storage is an inevitable part of it, and I think it's going to grow significantly as a result.
We could probably stay here all afternoon, morning. So thanks everyone for coming out. And it seems like we need to do another one of these soon so that we can keep this conversation going. Thanks so much to our panelists. Thank you, Olivia, for the wonderful presentation. Please reach out to me if you're interested in learning more about Sightline Climate, or if you had any trouble getting the report, I can help out with that. It's benji@sightlineclimate.com. And let's meet back here in a month, all right? Or maybe next quarter. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thank you.